Today's presenter is Dr. Armen Kemanian, Associate Professor of Production Systems and Modeling at Penn State University. Dr. Kemanian is interested in understanding and managing processes in agricultural and natural ecosystems. He maintains projects on biomass and bioenergy crops, adaptation of agriculture to climate variability, and organic agriculture. Armen specializes in developing and assembling simulation models of crops, soils, and landscapes, including those focused on carbon and nitrogen cycling in soils, and controls on plant water uptake and competition for resources in plant communities. Armen's research and program links fundamental research with societal concerns regarding food production, climate change, and the preservation of environmental integrity. Armen, thank you so much for joining us today to share the results of your recent work on growth and water use issues in these two crop systems, shrub willow and corn. You have our attention.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the polite introduction. I hope you can all hear me well, and good morning. So today we will talk about shrub willow and corn, and you can feel free to interrupt me if something is not clear, or type in the chat box, and we will address your questions immediately. There, a set of acknowledgements so we don't get distracted at the end before the questions. One, of course, to NewBio, which funded most of the work. Some of the equipment used for some of the measurements that I will show today were paid for with a grant from the R.K. Mellon Foundation, for which we are grateful. The Fulbright Commission partially fund a master student here that working with NewBio, co-funded by NewBio. That's Maria Laura Cangiano. And Felipe Montes can be considered a co-author of this presentation given his extensive input in the last 2 or 3 years. So an outline and goals. First, some of you know me. I like always to give a brief introduction of the context in which we do our work. So I'll give a brief energy outlook. Then we will talk about the growth and water use of both shrub willow and corn. Right from the beginning, the reason I'm using corn as a benchmark is because it's a crop that we all know fairly well, and it makes it easier to interpret information for a relatively new crop like shrub willow. Then we'll present, or along the side, what do we mean by Eddy covariance, which might not be a familiar term for folks that do not work with micrometeorological techniques, and then conclude with contextualizing what are the options for shrub willow use in the region in the context of this presentation. So energy, the outlook for energy. So this is a graphic from BP, which those energy industries, they have pretty good assessment of what are the sources of energy and what will be the projections for the future. And currently we are more or less in this breakout in the use of energy, a third from coal, a third from oil, a third from natural gas. This includes transportation, of course, and a relatively smaller fraction from renewables. When we look at what the use of this coal, oil, and natural gas causes is of course an increase in the emission of carbon dioxide. This graph, which has a lot of colors, but if you follow the arrow with me, the gray area essentially puts the boundary on how much carbon dioxide we are emitting into the atmosphere. The last few years, you can tell that after the end of World War II, the emissions really increased dramatically. It more or less matches up the increase in the gross product of the world. In this part led by the industrialized countries, and in the past decade by China and India in general, right, that are developing, the emissions per capita in the developed world are really decreasing, and have been doing so in the last year. They will decrease even more. Below is a little graph that shows the emissions due to land use change. They were higher during the period in which agriculture was expanding dramatically. Now they are decreasing, but still positive. And below, in the negative side of the curve, is what happened with these emissions of carbon dioxide. The light gray or light sky blue in the middle represents the amount of carbon dioxide that is increasing in the air. The dark blue is the one that is getting into the ocean, essentially the growth of algae and dissolved carbon dioxide. And the green one is what we call the residual land sink, which means carbon that is being stored mostly by the vegetation. So a lot of, there is a lot of carbon at play there. And here are the perspectives on what will happen with this. What will be the next sources of energy, essentially, for electricity generation. This is the last report, so from last year, from the Energy Information Administration in the US. So the panel in the left shows that were we to implement in full the clean power plant regulations, renewables will increase sensibly, is the green line here. The use of natural gas will spike, of course, and the use of coal will decrease. It won't get to zero, but it will decrease dramatically. If there is no CPP implementation, coal essentially remains flat. There is no increase in the power generation from coal, but natural gas and renewables will increase. So this green line for renewables is essentially what concerns us in the biomass world, right? That if biomass crops will be part of this upward trend, that is pretty unequivocal. The next slide is a bit of an overview of the US, and this is fresh from the press. And Sarah, I need to give you the source of this information because it's a report by University of Texas, and I don't think I put the source here, or I managed to delete it. In any case, this figure shows in different colors what will be the cheapest source of energy were we to build a new power plant generation, a new power plant for electricity generation. There is no need to go over the details, but you can see that there is a large fraction of the country that is green. That means that the cheapest option will be wind, electricity generated from wind. The orange part means that is natural gas, and those are the dominant sources. The purple to the left in the southeast is solar power generation, and the gray purple will be solar power generation, but essentially in the roof of the houses. Sky blue is nuclear power. That's an interesting graph, and one of the observations to be made here is that coal has very little room to grow. It's not that we don't want to use coal, it's simply that it's becoming more expensive than gas, and the improvements in technology and other renewables are pushing it aside. The second, the next graph will be the second most cheapest option, were not to be the primary. For example, in this area, if wind were not to be used for X reason, the second most cheapest source of energy will be nuclear, for example, in the Midwest. And what you can see is essentially an expansion of solar power generation in that case. So that's in this context, what is the room for energy crops? Essentially be used for co-firing if it is for energy or for other bioproducts. So biomass crops, when used for energy, essentially participate in a life cycle to produce that fuel. It all starts with the feedstock production, right here in this part, and of course it goes through the whole cycle in which the feedstock needs to be transported to a putative biorefinery. It is converted into a useful form of energy. It is distributed and is used. In this context, the use of feedstocks during the production part, which is what completes this presentation, has like two effects. On the one hand, to be useful, the emissions of greenhouse gases have to be lower than that of a competitive source, right? In this case, fossil fuel. The other part, that when we produce energy crops, we are using land. There is no magic here. If you are using land to produce bioenergy crops or biomass crops, something is being displaced. And And the point of producing biomass is that the terms of that displacement need to be favorable. And by favorable we mean that for some reason we achieve a very high productivity, and the point there is a very low price of that biomass, so that the production of fuel is cost effective. That it is in a location in which the product can be marketable and the logistic manageable. That means that there needs to be the transportation infrastructure to move the biomass around, and the area of the plantings needs to be large enough to make it friendly to relatively large scale management. And there has to be a benefit on the environmental side, right? A benefit that needs to be compared with something, right? It's not a benefit what we call attributional. It's a consequential. It's because the change to energy crop elicits an improvement over the prior condition. If we take as that prior condition the Chesapeake Bay, for instance, this is a satellite map of the Chesapeake Bay. The outer edge, the outline is not very clear, but it's this white line that I am going over, more or less here, going to New York now, down to Pennsylvania, and again into Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. Is where in this area these energy crops are planted. Energy crops are not planted anywhere where they to be planted. They need to substitute something, and in some cases replacing a forest can make very little sense, but replacing an area in which there is a lot of food production, just this part, the southeastern Pennsylvania, as you can tell, is wrapping around the Susquehanna right before the mouth gets into the Chesapeake Bay. In this case, the idea of including energy crops here is essentially because of the potential impact in the environment associated with high productivity because of the land, and because it's close to markets and probably to the end use. All the equipment for production is in place because agriculture is in place. It makes less sense in areas that are relatively remote from the infrastructure, in which displacing a forest, so to speak, will be both expensive and probably not the most clever option environmentally. So that's what I call putting this in context, and I'm using this in opposition to a very simplistic slogan of food versus fuel. I think that's just not a realistic option in our area, and a realistic comparison in our area. All right, the water balance. Here is again the Chesapeake Bay map, and now we are entering into the water considerations. This map shows in different colors the excess water, the water that is recharged the aquifers across the Chesapeake Bay. It is an average. It's not a particular year, but what will be on average. So of course it will vary in different years. But there are a couple of important things to show here. There are some parts like central PA here and southeastern PA that, because of the geology, have a pretty large recharge, right? More or less 240 millimeters. That's about 10 inches of water that will go below the rooting zone essentially and recharge the aquifer. Most of that water will find its way as base flow into the groundwater flow, into the rivers, right? But in that case, it will go through the soil and then move into the river. So that's water that will drag with it any solutes like nitrate, right? Nitrogen pollution, if that's the case. So when this infiltration and recharge happens in agricultural lands that may have readily available nitrogen for leaching, this is where some of the pollution will come around. So it's very easy to see that if there was agriculture here, this can be, or actually it is, a large source of pollutants. This number is good to remember, 240 millimeters, because we are going to come back to it at the very end of the presentation. So let's talk quickly about Shrub Willow. You have seen a lot of presentations regarding Shrub Willow, so I think I can move quickly through this one. Here is a picture of the crop. You can see the typical salix leaf here. It's a plant from and for temperate and cold regions, meaning that as we move, let's say, south of Virginia, even perhaps south of Pennsylvania, the warm temperatures are not very suitable for it. It really likes a nice winter. By that I mean a cold winter. There are some native species of shrub willow, so it's not a foreign to the country. Some of you may have visited the flats that are in the Grand Teton National Park, and there is one called the Willow Flats for a reason. It's just all shrub willow, and it extends from those latitudes, and it's one of the last plants to disappear close to the Arctic Circle. This is a type of shrub willow. So the ones that we plant grow desperately. It's like a plant that is in a hurry to keep growing, but it's not invasive. The plant itself grows, but it doesn't expand so much. And something that is good for us, because we want to cut it, it really loves to be cut. To be cut. It's a plant that needs to be cut to be vigorous. You know, it's meant for that to happen. So in the natural environment, the cutting will come from grazing from animals. Compared with corn, shrub willow is a temperate plant. You know, it uses what we call the C3 photosynthesis. Corn uses C4. It's a perennial versus an annual for corn. It has a relatively low demand for nitrogen because it is perennial and it grows over a large time window. You know, it can uptake that nitrogen and other nutrients throughout the growing season. Corn in particular has a very high demand for nitrogen in a very narrow time window, right? If we miss those 45 days in which corn needs that nitrogen in place, it will not grow. And of course, nitrogen that is not used by the plant is available for losses, for environmental losses. In general, it has a very low use of agrochemicals. That's not particularly true in the first year of establishment, but after that, it is essentially very low to zero use of agrochemicals. That's not the case for corn, of course. It's an annual crop. But, you know, on the negative side, because it is a perennial, and because it is woody, and because it is relatively expensive to establish, once it is in place, the land is committed for the crop for a relatively long term, as opposed to an annual crop that, you know, gives the flexibility of doing something else the following year. How do they grow? Well, this is an estimated growth rate average for this region for each crop, and is to present a very raw idea of what we should expect in terms of the result. It is in this axis is time, and so the day 101 is sometime in April in this region, and then entering into November in here. So this purple line here is what we should expect as an average growth for maize. You know, very low growth in the early months of April and May, then pretty accelerated growth in July, and then it will go down. And here is an expected curve for willow, cut more or less at the same time than corn. They start, you know, we will see that this is not that accurate, but willow will start a little earlier. But it starts earlier. It doesn't peak that high, but the growing season is longer. That's what we will expect in this area. How do we measure that? Well, you can go the old school style that, you know, you go to the field and keep cutting plants and weighting them. But there are some disadvantages of doing that. One, of course, the labor. The other is that we don't sample the roots. And we don't take into account other losses. When plants grow, you know, they take carbon dioxide from the air down, but the soil and the residues that are sitting there are being decomposed by the microbes, and therefore that sends the carbon dioxide up to the air. So what we're interested is in the net exchange, right? How much we gain in comparison to how much we lose in terms of carbon. And to do that, we use a technique called Eddy covariance. It's a very mature technique at this point. It's a micrometeorological technique, and I will, will assume that you're not familiar with it and try to explain it in simple terms. The Eddy covariance technique is based on measuring the flux of carbon in a horizontal plane. The vertical flow of some stuff. So here is this arm here is an anemometer that will measure wind speed. Here is a close-up view of that anemometer. The sensors, this emitter, this will emit a signal that is perceived by a sensor in this arm, and there are 3 of them. And some of the deviations in the signals from the time it is emitted to the time it is received allow to calculate the wind speed in the horizontal plane and in the 2 directions that are orthogonal, the vertical and essentially the x, the z, and the y axis over there. So we get a full picture of the wind direction. You may be wondering why vertical wind direction? Well, the air moves up and down, and as the air goes up in here, there can be no vacuum. So somewhere else, air is going down to balance the system, right? And so the net wind speed, this is not exactly accurate, but very close to accurate. The net vertical wind speed on a given time frame, let's say half an hour to 20 minutes, is 0, because there is as much air going down as air going up. But there are deviations, right? Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, and this allows to measure that oscillation. It also allows to measure the vertical oscillation, the horizontal oscillation in the wind speed. So what do we gain by that? We are measuring the wind speed in this direction at a given time, and at the same time we can measure the concentration of a given gas in that parcel of air. We essentially are measuring the upward flux of that gas. This sensor here is essentially capturing that parcel of air. So imagine a big bubble of air that is coming up in here and moving in this direction. As it goes through here, we can measure the concentration and the speed. A second later, another parcel of air will come down because this thing is constantly oscillating, and it will bring a concentration of a gas and also a velocity, and we can calculate a new downward flux. If we average these fluxes over half an hour, we get the net exchange of that quantity. So with this technique, that's Eddy covariance. With this technique, we can measure when the plants are growing, the downward flux of carbon dioxide, and if they are transpiring, the upward flux of vapor or water very accurately. This is called the closed system because we are capturing a gas sample at the same time that it is measured. So the gas sample will move down here and will be measured in a set of sensors that are down here. That will be this system, what we call the closed path, because the sample entered a closed system. The other sensor here, represented in this part, is identical, except that it's called an open path because the concentration of vapor and the gases are measured right in here, exactly at the same time that it is being measured. The reason to use these different two type of sensors side by side is that the open path works very well when there is no precipitation or dew, and essentially in the summer when the air is very hot, but it's pretty useless when it is foggy or raining. On the other hand, this sensor is extremely useful when it is foggy or rainy or at night. So a combination of the two gives the best shot at getting the full fluxes over time. So here are the solar panels that power the system, and this little tower here has what we call a net radiometer that measures the balance. Measures on the top the radiation that is incoming, and at the bottom the radiation that is outgoing, and we get what we call the net radiation. Alright, so here is another representation of that. it shows an eddy that is going down with a given concentration and speed, and here an eddy that is going down. And here is the formula used to calculate the fluxes. The over bar means the average. This is the vertical wind speed deviation from the average, and this is the concentration of whatever gas is there, and this is the density of the air that gives the mass that is flowing. All right, here is the ROCKVIEW field where we set up the sensors. This area in here will be where the willow is planted. This is an old picture, so it doesn't show the willow crop, but essentially this is all willow. This is all corn, and this is the windrows, and it shows that the wind direction, the dominant orientation here is from the west. So we have winds coming in this direction, and there are around 300 to 400 meters pitch in here. So the sensors are set up somewhere here. When we have wind coming from this direction, we essentially ignore the signal from the sensor because the signal is polluted by whatever vegetation is here, and so we essentially take the path when there is a minimum fetch that fulfills the requirement of the equipment to work. Right? It's giving some sort of averaging of the fluxes from here. If I come back to the prior slide, if you have a sensor here, the parcel of air that is coming here, if there is very little wind speed, is probably coming from very close to from underneath the sensor, and as the wind speed increases, is coming further away from the position of the sensor. This technique gives a lot of data. Sorry for the reformatting that happens when we go into Adobe Connect. This requires a lot of processing of the data. We get, I didn't tell you this, but essentially we are recording data 10 times per second, and we only report the average every half an hour, but all the data needs to be processed. It doesn't always come up clean. There are many reasons why sometimes we lose some data. This needs to be very cleanly processed, fill the gaps when we miss data, and so on and so forth. So 90% of the time is spent doing that, right? And really, Felipe, Maria Laura, and myself, we work pretty hard to get that data cleaned up for what we are going to show today. This simple equation here shows some of the assumptions made to make this work, and I will explain it clearly because it's not difficult to understand, but it's important to understand. Essentially, the energy that is available at a surface, so think of a canopy of corn or willow that is totally green and is essentially intercepting all the radiation that is coming from the sky, from the sun and the atmosphere, the diffuse radiation. Some of that radiation will come into the system, some of the radiation is reflected. There is a balance of thermal radiation as well, and whatever radiation that is received and is not re-emitted or reflected, it remains in the system as energy, right? It's the one that is used to heat up the system. G is re-emitted to heat the air, what we call sensible heat. Is used to evaporate water, that's transpiration, and is used to store heat in the plants themselves if they have a very large mass, like a wee canopy may have. So essentially, the net radiation is used for all those processes. It's also used for photosynthesis, but energy-wise, that's maybe less than 1% in the overall balance, so we ignore it here. This is important because we can measure the net radiation, and we can measure each of these terms separately, and it let us know how well we are doing. If we, that we call the energy closure problem. If we consume all the energy in the net radiation, we are doing well. But in general, the sensors fail at detecting these fluxes fully for different reasons, but they can be corrected if we get this information as well. And we will show that this was the case here, as is always the case. Here is the type of data that we get from the sensor. So in this axis here, there are dates. and you can see the progression of different days, and the sensor will have missing data, for example, because they were wet, because they ran out of battery and it was too dark, because mice chew on the cables. That's very often the case. And occasionally we get spikes in the measurements for multiple reasons, and so on. So the gaps need to be filled with a logical method. The spikes need to be detected, and because the data is just humongous, it needs to be done automatically. So we have methods to do spike detection and removal, and removal of some data because some of the conditions needed for the measurements were not met, and that needs to be checked. It says here U star, which is a relatively technical term, but all the methods that we use to come up with data that is reliable. And after doing that, here are the results. Sorry again because of the problem of formatting. So here is data for Shrub Willow, and here is data for maize. Here is the proportion of data that is missing for different variables. So for example, here is net radiation, and for net radiation we only lost data for one sensor here 20% of the time. For the soil heat flux, this is the energy that is used to heat the soil in spring, and essentially this energy is given back in the fall when the soil is cooling. So the sensors fail 20% of the time as well, or a little more than the net radiation. The vapor flux failed many times, and that's often the case because of the formation of dew, and usually at night. Sensible heat was a little bit better, and the exchange of carbon failed about 49% or so of the time in Shrub Willow. The one important thing to consider is that this is not even throughout the day. Usually the losses occur at night when the air gets stable, and when we have very low wind speed or near zero, stable conditions that usually are the same conditions that will cause bad air quality in a city. Those are conditions with the Eddy covariance technique doesn't work very well. And so normal conditions. The point to make here is, one, they need to have the closed path and the open path together to have some hope of getting good data. Unfortunately, we did exactly that. Here are the results, the raw results after filtering with no gap filling. Here is as we go on. What happens with the green line is the gap filling. When we put these two together, we get the full series of growth, and you can see that the pattern of the black and the green is pretty similar. So whatever technique we use, I'm not going into the details, seems to work fairly well. I can take advantage of this graph. Here are the seasons. Here is April, May, June, July, and so on until December. The negative numbers that we see here are the carbon gains, and as you can see in spring it goes up, essentially more growth, stabilizes over the summer, and then goes down as the plants yellow and the temperature goes down. The constant spiking is the night and day. So the big drops here are the uptake of carbon dioxide. That's why we use a negative signal, and the positive is the night respiration or the day respiration. So an extremely accurate picture of what the willow plants are doing. Here is a close-up view. We are going to do a close-up view of 3 different periods during the growing season: at the beginning of the growing season, in the middle of the growing season, and in the end. So here is the one for the beginning, just for willow. We can see that this I will show one so we can quickly move through the others. The black graph here is the net radiation in a sunny day. As you can tell, is a very symmetric curve because essentially there are no clouds, a little bit of clouds here, but it has to be like this. The lines below are the latent heat, LE. This in here means evaporation. And you can tell how evaporation becomes higher in the afternoon, and then at night it goes down and becomes essentially zero. This is the heating of the air, the sensible exchange, and this is the soil getting heated here, right? So very, very clean curves. As you move, these are 3 consecutive days, 1 day that is sunny and 2 days that have clouds. The broken path here means that the sun was coming up and everything was going fine, and then cloudiness, and then the clouds went up, went down, was clear sky again, then clouds again, and so on and so forth. And you can see how the latent heat operates and the other terms. Here below is the growth of the plant, the net carbon exchange essentially. So at night there is a loss of carbon dioxide in this part, then it starts gaining carbon dioxide quickly, then losses at night, very minor, then gaining again. Let's move into this one here. You can tell, when the sun picks up, the signal goes down, uptakes carbon dioxide. When there are clouds, it goes down again, and as the sun comes up again, the uptake is very fast again. So the sensor really tells you everything that is happening with these plants. So the next slide is for corn. Early in the season, this curve, this upper part, at least let's see, let me capture this green arrow. The radiation part should be very similar. There are different sensors, so you suspect some differences, like in here it's different than in here, but very similar patterns, right? But you can tell that the transpiration is much lower. Here is willow, here is corn, almost no evaporation, because there is no canopy. It's essentially residue with a few little plants there in the beginning of June. And you can see that it's not gaining any carbon, right? It's barely edging out because the plants are growing, just starting to grow here, right? Showing some interest in growing faster. At the same time, willow is already, getting a pretty hefty gain in carbon. As we go into the middle of the growing season, this will change. You can see both at the same time. Both are growing heavily, but you can tell that corn is actually, when it's very sunny, when the radiation is very high, it's really having quite a bit of growth, and they become comparable, so to speak. And as we go to the end of the growing season, we see again the same pattern of corn starting to, it's not growing, it's already the end of September, so all the corn is yellow, but willow keeps putting some biomass on, right? So it's a very interesting way of looking at this. Talking about the energy balance closure, essentially how well we did with the measurements of evaporation and heat that is transferred to the air and that part. Let's pay attention to this lower part, this 18%. It means that for willow, when we compare the net radiation with the way the radiation would use the latent heat and the sensible heat was used, we miss about 18% of the energy. What does it mean that we missed the energy? Evidently energy is conserved, there is no magic here, although that will be very interesting if there were any magic. But there isn't. The only thing that we are learning is that we are missing flux, that there is part of the evaporation at the heat that the covariance method is not detecting. There are reasons for that to happen. I think the easiest way to imagine this is that the sensor that I show you, the anemometer with the sensor, has a given size and therefore detects with more efficiency certain eddy size and not others. A very large eddy might be missed, very small eddies might be missed, particularly those small ones. And in that case, some of the essentially we are not detecting all the energy that is going, but part of it. But that means that the latent heat and the evaporation and the sensible heat needs to be adjusted upward to match up this 18% that is lost. In the case of corn, this was worse. It was 33% of the energy, but they are both within what is observed, right? With these systems, particularly in the conditions of our landscape that is not perfectly flat, so you do get more oscillations. further proof, one, of the energy closure problem, but also of how well we are measuring the fluxes is the following curve, which I will explain slowly because it is worth doing. It is a plot, the green one of through the couple of weeks in July, actually more than that, a full month, July to August, the evaporation in millimeters per day. So for example, a number like 5 is a fifth of an inch of evaporation in a day. And here is what we measured, right? Up and down in the order of 4 millimeters per day. The black line here is a theoretical calculation used what we call the Penn-Monteith equation. The Penn-Monteith equation is another equation that has no magic. It's just a plain application of the first law of thermodynamics that, essentially we input the temperature, the radiation load, the vapor in the air, and the wind speed, and estimate how much evaporation should be happening in that environment. And what we see is that the calculated values and the measured values, there is an underestimation, but the pattern is almost perfect, right? How it mirrors the others. So it means that the measurements, the relative number of the measurements are correct, but the underestimation of energy is there. So we got proof that we could correct it. Here the underestimation comparing the ET and the for corn, here is willow, for willow is about 86%, meaning 86% of the ET, the reference ET is what we are measuring with the uncorrected values, so at least we need to correct the flux by 15% or so to come close. Now we don't need to match this number, right? It's just a reference because, were we to use this curve, why will we be measuring this? So, in short, is that the method works in relative terms and that the underestimation of the energy flux is there, but that can be corrected. Alright, here is a plain comparison of corn and willow. The black line is willow, the green line is corn here. The top panel shows the essentially half-hourly data. The lower panel shows the average daily value. Anytime that you can see the black on top of the green, essentially here it means that willow is growing more. Every time you see the green, it means that corn is growing more than willow. And here is the balance, is easier to see. What you can see is that early in the season, willow is growing pretty fast, and corn actually is respiring a lot. These are the residues of corn from the prior year that is being respired, essentially. And in the middle of July, when it is hot, a good C4 plant like corn grows like crazy. And but then it starts senescing. Willow is, once gets the canopy established, is pretty consistent throughout the season, right? This year was very rainy or a pretty decent amount of rain, so I don't think we have a single day with a water shortage. So the biomass of corn was very high, and as the curves tell, the ones for willow were as well. Here is the net balance, this curve. When we accumulate the carbon flux, let's do this for willow. The dotted line is the one that is corrected by the energy. You can tell that at the beginning of April, May is still losing carbon, but then it starts growing really fast, essentially until mid-October. Right? It's pretty impressive. It is putting biomass in until mid-October, and then the respiration is pretty low. It's losing a little bit here. Because the soil is still warm, even below a foot, let's say, and the respiration is detected. Here is corn. It loses essentially for a relatively long time, and once it starts growing, it takes off pretty fast. This is the slope. You can tell that the slope is a little bit faster than that of willow. That's the C4 condition, but then it stops. Right, maturity arrives, and there are almost 2 months in which willow keeps going and corn is already flattened out. Here are some calculation of what's the difference in favor of willow, which is pretty hefty in this field. Here is the evaporation. It shows a very similar curve than that of growth. The interesting thing is how much evaporation happens early in the season for shrub willow right here. When corn is barely evaporating, so there is a drier soil here. You can think of it as the soil under willow being a better sponge for further precipitation. Instead of letting it run off, there is room to store it. And the same happens late in the fall, right? The same conditions. So, and here's the cumulative water use. We get about 20. Let's see. This green line here is corn. Is in the order of 18 or so inches of water, and that for corn is in the order of 22 inches. Excuse me, for willow, 22 inches of water. The difference here is how much more water was evapotranspired by willow in the same period. Without paying attention to all the numbers, let's look at this 99. It's essentially 100. If we come back to the number that I asked you to remember at the beginning of the presentation, that there was a recharge of about 240 millimeters in the area on average. Here is the difference between having a canopy of willow or a canopy of corn. There is less recharge by at least 99 millimeters in the case of shrub willow. So it's a number that can be used when we say regulate the hydrological cycle, something that we hear a lot. This is exactly what we mean. We can slow down that runoff, and both the runoff and the underground recharge, and then that water will move quickly through the rivers with the use of a canopy like willow. That's a very impressive. This is a very impressive difference. I cannot think of any other way of making such a large difference in the water balance of two crops. The only thing that is comparable will be a mixed canopy of maybe orchard grass and alfalfa, but I don't think it will make that much of a difference as willow is doing. Might be close. Were we to take this into account into a full landscape, we need to we need to be able to model essentially all the components of the water balance. So this cell here shows a piece of a field that if we put it together, each of these triangles in a given watershed is each little grid point here will be one of these triangles, and do the water balance and move the water in the landscape. Get it from the upper part here is a forest down into the stream, and then move the water. The water in here can exchange with the groundwater that is underneath and essentially go to the outlet to another river. We can follow nitrogen, we can follow pollutants that move through that water and see where they are lost, trap them if that is possible. This is what a model will let us do that is very difficult to do with measurements. Here is a simulation putting that together for a given area. I need to move quickly so we get to the end here, but setting up a simulation like this takes quite a bit of work. You need to get the land use, the soils, the hydrology, anyway, many things go in there. Run the simulations to get different outputs, and I show you some outputs here. For example, it is the corn biomass production in a given watershed. This is about 5 hectares, so the order of 14 or so acres. Each triangle is a piece of ground, and you can see that because of the difference in irradiance, difference in soil depth, and the water movement, there are differences in the total biomass production. So there are some areas that are less productive than others, right? This is a north-facing part. North-facing, south-facing part. Here is a stream going through here, and there are differences in the growth. It is what happens with the nitrogen on average in that soil. And just to give you a quick visual, there are some parts in which nitrogen is concentrated, and you can see there is water moving downward and dragging nitrogen in this direction, and you can see the concentration towards the outlet. And doing an experiment here to see if we can trap that nitrogen is very difficult, but doing the experiment in a virtual mode, adding a biomass crop like willow or switchgrass into a buffer stream around the stream, causes this pattern in nitrogen right here. So here is how the measurements start to meld with the modeling to compare these numbers, right? So we get learn when and how much of the nitrogen that can be leaching from a corn crop can be trapped by the biomass crop before it goes to the outlet of a watershed. And that's I haven't gone deeply into the modeling side, but that's how we use this information. Some people many times ask, how sure are you that the model is working well? Well, because we compare with measurements when we can, but not all the measurements are easy to do, but some are. And now we know how much of the water needs to evaporate, needs to go out from the plant, and therefore we have quite a bit of a sure, I will say, anchor for our modeling efforts with that. All right, what will we conclude from this presentation? Well, first, the shrub willow is a very strong sink for carbon dioxide. Essentially, it produces a lot of biomass because it grows for a long time in this region, essentially from April, more or less from the second week of April to the end of October, solidly. Compared with corn in that area, in at least in the year that we compare, the difference was staggering. Corn was at best a neutral source of carbon dioxide. It means that we lost as much as we gained. It was probably negative, really, in this particular year. And an interesting finding here that we always suspect that was the case, but now that we have this document, is that willow can be deployed to use more water or extract more nutrients when and from where needed, right? How much of this will be a benefit for water quality or water regulation downstream? Well, that's a bit more difficult to do, and that's what the type of information that we are going to get from using these models more fluidly. So stay tuned for the next presentation, I guess. That's what I had to say. This picture is a willow field in the end of the beginning of November, somewhere there. It looks yellower than it actually is, but you can tell that it's getting yellow at the same time that all the oak trees are already, getting that brownish color in the background here. So further proof of the wonderful use of the growing season that this crop can do. That's all I have to say, Sarah, and I will be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much. Looks like we have at least one question already in the chat pod. For other participants, feel free to keep asking your questions. We'll just go until we run out the clock here. So Larry comments that a lot of greenhouse gases were released in making the fertilizer for corn. So does the modeling that you do sort of take into account those broader parameters for life cycle?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. In a life cycle assessment, yes, that needs to get into the equation, and that will add to the losses for corn. We didn't show the full life cycle assessment here, just what will be the carbon exchange. In the life cycle assessment at the feedstock level, the first difference is made by the biomass, by the carbon balance. The second is probably nitrous oxide, if not the first. And in the nitrous oxide part is where the fertilizer comes to play. There is more loss because of the nitrous oxide than because of the production of the fertilizer, but definitely that's a big piece.
Thanks. David has just posted in the chat pod the link to that UT Austin study that you referred to earlier. We'll be sure to include that in the notes with the archived recording for this presentation. That was back from.
Exactly. Yeah.
Thanks. All right, let's maybe pose a few more questions here. So as you think about the results from measuring fluxes in these two crop systems, how does that translate to, or does it translate to other perennial or conventional annual crop systems, at least in general terms? So how do the results of this study for these two specific crops fit in context of what the same Eddy covariance approaches have shown for systems like native shrubland or mixed perennial grasslands or even early successional forests, which would be sort of somewhat similarly behaving on the landscape? I know, perhaps the reference data that you showed offer some comparisons there, but do you have sort of any specific takes on that?
Yeah. So based on the observations and based on experience and some data that that we haven't shown. I will say that the behavior of willow is essentially almost an outer edge of how much evaporation can happen. And it will be very hard to go above that. Will the native forest land evaporate more than willow? I doubt it. I presume it will be as much or less. One of the reasons is just the height of the trees. The other is because I have measured what we call the stomatal conductance, and willow has the stomata open like a desperate plant, right? And other trees have much lower conductance, a third of what we observe in willow. So I think willow gives you an upper bound, a pretty solid upper bound. Comparing corn with other crops or with other land uses, I presume soybean will be close to corn. The peak transpiration will be a little lower. And perennial grasses will be maybe in the 70% or so of what willow, of the willow transpiration, something of that nature.
Thanks. I want to turn again to the CZO simulations. So those that incorporated the results of this Eddy covariance study are a little more readily accomplished because the baseline parameters in the CZO have been so extensively measured and mapped. Do you see other accessible opportunities to incorporate the results of this study into models at much larger scales? You mentioned, for example, Chesapeake Bay buffers with larger spatial data sets that may have less detail.
Yeah, we are. Let me go back here a little bit. These graphs, this little, let's see, or this graph that we see in the lower corner here. This is part of the Mahantango watershed. So we are going into relatively large watersheds and applying the same technique. And here is a drawing of a proverbial buffer in here, and it's doable. I don't think there is a limitation on the data. Let's see. Let me word this properly. There is definitely a limitation on the data but to learn the behavior of the system, we don't need the amount of detail that we have in other areas like the CZO that you are mentioning. I don't think the details in the CZO added anything to the simulation that we did there. It was more because the setup, we could run it and have a good sense of what we should get. We weren't doing simulations blind, so to speak, so we could make sense of the outputs, and there were errors, interpret them quickly, and that get us ready to do this one, essentially, which is a much larger scale. So I guess running this piece of Mahantango may take a day and a half just to get an output and make sure that we did everything right. But it's doable. It gets a little worse in karst geologies because modeling the hydrological part is just difficult. It's not that the models are difficult to do, it's that how do we model? It happens to be a huge crack that lets water flow very quickly through a given path. It's captured through the calibration, but it may not be perfectly well captured where in that watershed that flow is happening. So it's happening through this grid points, or it's a little bit further south. We may miss that. The final flow in the river will be fine, but the exact position in the landscape might be off. That's the type of thing that we need to be wary of.
Thanks. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that about karst systems, but it certainly makes sense. That's important to keep in mind. David, thanks you for the very interesting presentation. He says, this helps me think about the growth of biomass crops from a different perspective. Would you say that this should also enable us to choose the best natural locations for growing willow and other short rotation crops based on precipitation and groundwater required? So now we're getting into optimal siting considerations.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and I think that's where this type of exercise becomes more useful, is for targeting. What is the impact of siting an X area, 400 acres, 500 acres, 100 acres of willow or over the biomass crop, what does it do to the stream nearby or to the groundwater? And I'll presume this is one of the main uses of a simulation system like that collects this information and gives the output. And we don't run 1 year, right? We run 30 years, and we get to see the full range of variation. You know, may get some years in which different systems behave similarly because of the distribution of precipitation, and some years in which they are extremely different. And it's very difficult to guess that without a model that helps you think.
Yeah, thanks, David, for bringing that up. I'm conscious of the time. We're running up against the end here. So if there are any last-minute questions, I invite you to type those in now. But in the meantime, I want to thank Armen for joining us today. This is a really interesting overview, and it certainly brought up a lot of good questions. Armen, is there kind of a... you gave us a few sort of takeaway lessons from this work, but is there any kind of last-minute thing you want to leave us with?
Well, I think I covered the ground that I wanted to mention, but one of the things is that the willow as a plant is a fairly impressive how much water it can take, and that can be a management tool for us in this area of where we will have probably excess water and perhaps excess precipitation. So it makes a lot of sense to keep an eye on this one. The same applies to some of the perennial grasses. The perennial grasses will have a different hydrological behavior though, and I think that's something to be very mindful when we design buffer strips, to try to merge the positive aspects of the perennial grasses and willow in a smart way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it certainly gives us a lot to think about and look forward to as your research continues. Thanks again, Armen, and thank you everyone for joining us today. A copy of this presentation will be available through the New Bio website very shortly. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all. Bye-bye.